What would life be without the internet? And what if the internet was not accessible in a fair and equal or non-discriminatory way? Net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers should enable access to all content and applications regardless of the source and without favoring or blocking particular products or websites. At a time when the US is working to withdraw net neutrality, and that move is drawing a lot of criticism, the Indian regulator has taken a rather bold step in affirming our commitment to it. After much consultation, the TRAI has released its recommendations on net neutrality. And to talk about them, we have with us Chairman RS Sharma. Mr. Sharma, good afternoon. Thank you very much for speaking with Bloomberg Queen. Let me start by asking you to articulate the principle on the basis of which you have decided today that internet access should not be discriminatory in any fashion, and that access services should be governed by a principle that restrict any form of discrimination, interference in both the treatment of content as well as in the way it is delivered.
Yeah, so as you yourself said, that the overarching principle which actually guided us is essentially the fact that internet should remain an open platform. Nobody owns internet, and therefore internet belongs to everybody. So once having this principle in mind, what we have said is that no internet access service provider will be able to discriminate the access of content on the internet, either by way of differentially pricing it, and as you know, for that we had already issued regulation last February of 2016. Then no internet service provider will also be able to do a discrimination in terms of providing fast lane, throttling, or blocking the content. So these are now the part of those recommendations which we are sending into, which we have already sent to DOT.
All right. Sir, to understand better the many recommendations that you've made today, can you also explain whether some of these definitions are already hard-coded by TRAI, or should we expect the Department of Telecommunications to add to them? For instance, the definition of Internet Access Services and the definition of specialized services, as well as the definition of Internet of Things. And I'll explain why I'm talking about this. You have said no discriminatory treatment whatsoever, but you've made two exceptions to that. One is for specialized services and one is for critical services or critical IoT services, if I may call it that. So can you lay out the principle behind both of these two and when the definitions will be clear?
Yeah, sure. You see, the point is that once you are saying that there shall be no discrimination, this is the overarching principle. Now, obviously, there will be exclusions to that principle. Exclusion as in, certain services may be using the internet protocols, but they may not be, using the public internet. For example, as you know, the public internet is on the best effort basis. And there may be certain services where you have the quality of service specifications done because they are so critical by their very nature. And therefore, they have to be excluded from the provisions of these sort of stipulations of net neutrality. Now, let me give you an example of some of those services. For example, if you are having a remote surgery, now that remote surgery will require a dedicated connection to the other site. You are having, let's say, autonomous cars is another example. So what we are saying is that, or for example, enterprise-wide, networks created through leased lines and stuff like that. So these are some of the things which should remain outside the purview of net neutrality. So in some sense, we call them exclusions. Then there are other issues which are relating to pipes, which is essentially, when there is a traffic jam on the road, the road owner or the road operator has to provide for a smooth traffic control. So essentially what we are talking is the traffic management practices which the operator should be entitled to impose, because ultimately they are the ones who are running these networks. So one is traffic management practices. Of course, there are other eventualities, like for example, if the government has decided to block a site, then obviously this blocking will take place. Similarly, if there are emergency situations where fast lanes are to be provided, then those have to be provided. So essentially, we are on the one hand talking exclusions from the perspective of specialized services, and the other hand we are talking of traffic management practices and exceptions by way of ensuring that the traffic flows. For example, if there is a attack on the network, a cyber attack on the network, obviously the telecom service providers or the internet service providers will have to take adequate steps to ensure that the network is safe and secure, and for that particular period they may have to impose certain restrictions. So what we have said is that there are two issues. One is that these traffic management practices must be transient. That means they should be available, they should be applicable only for the time being. They should also be proportionate, and they should be transparent. So all these three attributes must be applicable to the traffic management practices. We have also provided for full disclosures. So there should be disclosure by the telecom service providers to the effect as to when did they apply these traffic management practices, and what were the effect of these practices on the consumer experience. So I think we have made appropriate pragmatic exceptions and exclusions to the policy, but then the overall goal remains that the consumer must have the choice of accessing any content on the internet, and the telecom service providers or the ISPs should not in any way be able to influence those choices.
Fair enough, sir. You've mentioned, if I understand correctly, that specialized services have been defined in your recommendations, but you've also said the Department of Telecommunications may identify specialized services. Just to understand this better, does this give the DOT leeway to add to your definition, or within the scope of your definition to identify specific specialized services that can avail of these exclusions that you referred to?
No, let's understand this, that there are two provisos which we have recommended. One is that these specialized services should not be a substitute for internet services.
Right.
So essentially one should not start using the term specialized services for a normal internet and in garb of that provide fast lanes or other kinds of things to these services. So these are certain provisos which we have created. On the other hand, you should also understand that the kind of services which can happen in future, and which it's a developing field. It's not a static area. So technology is developing very fast, and what we have said is that the Department of Telecom may from time to time define these services, provided they satisfy the criteria which we have laid down in our recommendations.
Would the same principle apply to IoT services? Because the recommendations say that critical IoT services which may be identified by DOT and which satisfy the definition of specialized services would be automatically excluded. So there too the DOT has some leeway to be able to identify. Absolutely. Based on changing technology?
No, what we are saying is that the IoT as a class is not specified as a specialized services, but there may be certain services which may require specialized treatment. For example, autonomous cars, as and when they come. So essentially, what we are saying is that specialized services will obviously depend on the nature of the evolving technology as they evolve. So we cannot hard code all the or enumerate all the services as specialized services. So that's why we have left that thing that the DOT as a licensor should be able to prescribe as to what other specialized services can be categorized as specialized services.
Okay, fair enough, sir. So when does this, and I have a couple of more questions. I'll come back to this in terms of, like, for instance, if I understand correctly, content delivery networks, are exempted from the scope of any restriction on non-discriminatory content. Yes. Again, can you give us some illustrations for us to understand exactly what you mean by content delivery networks and who would be availing of the exemption?
No, let's we all understand the content delivery networks, and I'm not going to define them for you. But what I can say is that there are certain websites which are very, very frequently accessed. And what happens as the content managers of those websites They actually, in order to ensure that their customers have better user experience, they hire or engage contract delivery networks, which essentially cache these contents, and then the cached content is kept within the premises or within the scope of the network TSPs or ISPs. So essential idea is that this way the content delivery networks facilitate the accessing of the content on the internet. So in no way this practice is discriminatory in the sense that the TSPs have no role to play in that. It is the content providers who are actually making arrangements to ensure that their content is easily accessible to their customers.
Sir, could you explain the timeline of how and when this will all become applicable? You have referred these recommendations to the Department of Telecommunications. Forgive me if I'm using the wrong word, but does that mean that the DOT needs to sign off on this? How does it proceed or progress from here?
No. Let's understand that this recommendation is within the TRAI Act, where the Department of Telecom, that is the Government of India, had asked the TRAI to provide comprehensive recommendations on net neutrality. Sure. That was last year in the month of April or May. And since then, so this is in compliance with their request that we have sent these recommendations today morning to the Department of Telecommunications. Now, obviously, it is for the Department of Telecommunications to take a final call, and these are merely recommendations.
Sure, sir, but I understand that you've also said this, and please explain this to me. You said these recommendations are being made without prejudice to the powers and functions conferred upon the TRAI as per the Act. Therefore, pending the consideration of these recommendations, the authority may regulate the manner in which the current licensing requirement of unrestricted access to all content on the internet is implemented and enforced. The authority may also frame regulations or take other measures as and when deemed necessary. So now does the ball shift into the DOT's court, or does the TRAI, having made these recommendations, still have within its powers the right to enforce them?
I think this is a very important question which you have asked. Essentially, what happens is that the TRAI Act provides certain powers to Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and these are in the domain of, let's say, tariff fixation. So on tariff, the TRAI has complete control. Similarly on interconnections, similarly on quality of service. So there are certain areas which fall within the TRAI jurisdiction. So what we are saying is that these recommendations may contain all kinds of, these recommendations may have some elements of, quality of service, some elements of tariff, and therefore those elements on which TRAI has the powers to regulate, TRAI will continue to regulate. That's what we have essentially said. So, for example, if you recollect, last February of 2016, we issued a regulation which actually prohibited the discriminatory tariff on the internet. So, essentially, that regulation we did not send to the government because tariff is our area of operation. Tariff is where we have the mandate under the TRAI Act. So that's what we are basically saying, that these recommendations will not obviously affect the functions which TRAI is performing under its Act.
So are you telling me, sir, that in the worst case eventuality, the DOT may choose not to implement these recommendations?
No, this is not a question of that. It's a question, it's just basically we are just clarifying that these recommendations, obviously DOT has the absolute prerogative to accept these recommendations, not accept these recommendations. That's their prerogative. They asked for the recommendations and we have given the recommendations. So that's where the matter ends.
All right. Do you have any, or can you share any information with us on what could be the potential timeline? Because from what I understand, all the licensees will in effect have to be redone. So this provision of net neutrality will have to be included in all the license conditions for all the various categories of licenses, etc. And thereafter, there might be some rule making also required, for instance, on, I think, some of these areas that TRAI has already defined. In case the DOT would want to further define them, specialized services, the critical class class of IoT? What is the timeline for all of this to become a reality of sorts?
No, let me put it this way, that while the unified license may not actually speak about the internet access services, but the broad spirit of unified license is very clear that the telecom service providers shall provide access in a non-discriminatory manner, without any sort of discrimination among subscribers or among the various classes of subscribers. So therefore, it is not as if the current provisions of the license do allow any scope of discrimination and like that. What we are saying is that we must we must update in some sense in this new digital world. We must update the licenses in terms of very clearly saying that the internet access will be following these principles of net neutrality.
By when do you expect this to be a reality, Mr. Sharma? Assuming that the DOT will take on record your good effort on this and will accept all your recommendations in total.
I think you are asking the question to a wrong person. It is for the DOT to, you should ask the DOT secretary this question, but I'm sure the government had asked for our recommendations. We have given our recommendations, and I'm sure government will give the due thought to the recommendations.
No, of course, I'm not denying that at all. It's just that at this point in time, this net neutrality debate has taken an odd turn worldwide. In the US, as you know, the FCC is reconsidering withdrawing it in the face of, tremendous opposition from citizens and activist bodies. And so I'm just curious to know whether we are committed to a timeline on being able to implement these net neutrality principles that you have articulated, or that this debate may veer off course in the days and weeks to come thanks to Western influence?
Is that a question or a comment?
It's a question.
So, I can't really give you the timeline because, as I explained to you, it is the recommendations are to be accepted by the Department of Telecom. So we'll do that. The only thing which I can say is that these recommendations have been taken, are being given after a huge, longest running consultation, I think, in the history of TRAI. I'm not sure as to whether any subject has been deliberated and consulted for such a long time. As you know, the DOT gave a reference to us in the April of last year, and from then on we had a pre-consultation paper on net neutrality in the month of May last year. And then in January this year, we issued this consultation paper, and it has again taken about 10 months to sort of fructify or to come to a conclusion. We have consulted all stakeholders, and the only thing which I can say, as in our view, in the TRAI's view, this is actually very, very contextual, in the sense that for a country like India, where the internet is really a platform for innovation, information interchange, and riding a lot of applications, I think it's extremely important for us that the internet as a platform is kept open, free, and without any discriminatory principles of access. So I think it is very, very important from our country's perspective. We have programs like Digital India, we have programs where we are having the digital identity infrastructure, we have the unified payment interface, we have banking. Everything is riding on the internet, the health, education, irrigation, agriculture. So essentially, if internet is such an important sort of platform on which a lot of these applications and systems are going to ride, it is important that that platform is kept open and free.
We'll let that be the last word, sir. Thank you very much for explaining the recommendations that you have issued today. We hope that the Department of Telecommunications pays heed to them very quickly, and this becomes a reality in India very quickly. Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for joining us here on Bloomberg Quint.
Thank you very much.